Studies. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this special event dedicated to the poet Ana Luísa Amaral, a very special person who was dear to our hearts, a former colleague of mine at the Faculdade de Letras in Porto. Also a person whom we had several times welcomed at our institute here in Berkeley, but of course, above all, a great poet and therefore a great loss to Portuguese literature. So I'm very glad that my colleagues Diolinda and Duarte, together with our dear colleague who's now in Edinburgh, Inês Lima, took the initiative and to organize this event to honor the legacy of Ana Luísa Amaral. So maybe, Duarte, I'll pass it on to you, and you can tell a little bit more about the format of the event and how we will proceed in the coming hours.
Sure.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Adam. And welcome everybody to this event. I would like to, on behalf of the Center for Portuguese Studies, thank Diolinda from UC Berkeley, and also Inês from the University of Edinburgh for being present in this event. We're going to talk about one of the greatest Portuguese poets, Ana Luísa Amaral, that passed away in August. And this event basically is a homage to Ana Luísa Amaral. I would like to thank as well our sponsors, such as FLAD and Camões Institute, namely the Cátedra Ana Atterley here at UC Berkeley. And also, Ana Luísa Amaral was here several times. She was a writer in residence at UC Berkeley. And also, she participated in many, many events of the Cátedra Ana Atterley in 2017. In fact, as a matter of fact, I would like to start this event by reading a poem of Ana Luísa Amaral that she read here in 2017 called Testament. And then I'll pass to the questions to our guests. We'll have 15 minutes at the end. This will be an interview to our guests. We'll have 15 minutes in the end for questions and answers. Please feel free to put it on the chat. This is being recorded and broadcast on the YouTube of the IS YouTube channel. So if you don't want to be recorded, please turn off your cameras. But at the end, we'll have some time to ask questions to our guest speakers. So I'll start by reading this poem called Testament. I'm about to fly off somewhere, and my fear of heights plus myself finds me resorting to tranquilizers and having confused dreams. If I should die, I want my daughter always to remember me, for someone to sing to her even if they can hold a tune, to offer her pure dreams, rather than a fixed timetable or a well-made bed. To give her love and ability to look inside things, to dream the blue suns and brilliant skies, instead of teaching her how to add up and how to peel potatoes. To prepare my daughter for life, if I should die on a plane and be separated from my body and become a free-floating atom in the sky. Let my daughter remember me and later on say to her own daughter that I flew off into the sky. And I was all dazzle and contentment to see that in her house none of the sums added up and the potatoes were still in their sack, forgotten, entire. So with this first poem, I would like to invite, I'll start with Diolinda, the same question, and more generic questions to Diolinda, and the same question for Inês. And the first question has to do with the poem. And what legacy, I'll start with Diolinda, what legacies, or the greatest legacy, in your opinion, did Ana Luísa Amaral leave us? Diolinda.
Wow, that's a loaded question to start with. Let me start by saying good morning to everybody who's joined us and thank them. And by saying that this is the very least we could possibly do for someone like Ana Luísa, who was so generous to the Center for Portuguese Studies, as she was to everyone. and to ask for your forgiveness if at any moment I become emotional. She was a dear, dear friend, whom I miss very much. And so I beg your forgiveness for that. Ana Luísa's legacy for me is she was exactly as a human being should be. She was generous to a fault. She was giving, she was creative and shared her art like few others. She was accessible. She was welcoming to all friends and to people she barely knew. So to me, that is the biggest legacy that we could hope. She taught us how to be humans as humans should be. Maybe that sounds silly when I'm talking about someone who produced such an enormous and great body of work, recognized with awards, some of the largest awards for poetry, particularly in Europe, as Reina's, one of the last awards she received. So that may sound simple, but it really is what I feel.
Thank you, Delinda. Inês, same question.
I would like to, in order to answer your question, I would like to probably speak a little bit about how I met Ana Luísa Amaral, because I think this will explain actually part of her legacy. I was a student at University of Porto, where Ana Luísa Amaral was teaching English literature. When I got there, I did not know Ana Luísa Amaral. I had never heard of her. This was in the 90s. She started publishing in 1990, and I enrolled in this university in 1997. And unfortunately, I still didn't know her at that time. There were several teachers teaching English literature. I just chose the one that fitted my schedule better, which unfortunately was not Ana Luísa Amaral. But shortly afterwards, her, students started speaking a lot about her. So she, really had a reputation as a wonderful teacher. So one day, I was so curious that I asked her to attend one of her classes, just to audit her classes from the back of the classroom. And of course, it was a completely different class. It really felt like the students had a really great relationship with her. It felt like a group of friends discussing literature, while of course doing very serious work. The discussions were really about topics that I was not actually discussing in my other classes, topics of gender, society, politics, and women writers, which were topics that were new to me at the time. So I was really, really impressed. Unfortunately, I was not her student while I was at the University of Porto, but several years later, I did have classes with her at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth, here in the United States. I was a PhD student then, and we just had wonderful classes with her. Before that, though, and this also explains her legacy, as a master's student, Ana Luísa Amaral was running the Institute of Comparative Studies at the University of Porto, Instituto Margarida Loza, the Margarida Loza Institute, and she was leading a research project on the new Portuguese letters. One of her most important legacies is her work in rediscovering and shedding new light on Portuguese women authors and women authors of Portuguese-speaking countries, Brazil as well, Portuguese-speaking African countries. She was leading this research project that was groundbreaking in Portuguese literature. This was about 3 women writers, Maria Teresa Horta, Maria Isabel Barreno, and Maria Velho da Costa. who had written a groundbreaking work during the dictatorship. They were imprisoned for it. The book was charged for being an attempt to morality and Portuguese society. The writers were imprisoned, and basically her research project was in celebration of the 40th anniversary of the publication of this book, and it was a way of analyzing the impact this book had in Portuguese literature, but also abroad. The translations that the book went through in different countries as well. And also, it really was important to see the impact that these three women had in Portuguese literature, but also society, and to the discussion of abortion, domestic violence, women's rights, the colonial war in Portugal. So I took part in this research project, and actually, to tell you the truth, if it hadn't been for that research project, I don't think I would be here now. I don't think I would have pursued an academic career in Portuguese literature, especially with a focus on women authors. She was incredibly generous to me and to my colleagues, always giving input into our work, connecting us with other scholars who could help us with our research, and as when we had classes with her at the University of Massachusetts, for example, her relationship with us really went beyond the classroom. She took us to Emily Dickinson's house, the writer that she focused on for her PhD. She read poems. She asked the people running the house if she could read poems aloud in this museum that was open to the public. So for every room that we visited, she had a different poem that she had selected expressly for us. She would read that poem aloud for us and to other guests, to the other visitors, with this really wonderful, deep, velvety voice that she had. She organized dinners where we would just tell jokes and just have fun, eat good food that she cooked as well. Mm-hmm. She would just be very, very generous and a wonderful, wonderful colleague and a wonderful teacher and a friend as well. So those are really wonderful memories. Of course, in terms of literature, I think her work was really, really groundbreaking in the way she shed new light into the women's writing, and basically how she read, how she redefined the literary canon in Portuguese literature. She wrote about.
Sorry, Ines, to interrupt you. My first question is about.
Of course, I could go on. So of course we will continue to speak about this.
You guys completely already changed the order of my questions, so to speak.
Oh, sorry for that.
But I'll try to keep my order because we're
okay.
About women's writing. But anyway, so the first question has to do with that, with redefining the canon, and I can you can keep going and then dealing that with answer. So from our first book published, and we're going to her poetry, right? From our first book published in 1990, Nossa Senhora de Quê, right? Ana Luísa Amaral was always fascinated by the Greek...
Não é Nossa Senhora de Quê, Minha Senhora
de Quê, sorry. Was fascinated by the Greek mythology. In your opinion, why is it so important for Ana Luísa Amaral to retell history starting from the Greeks? And of course, if you'd like to give some examples.
Yes, thank you. Well, in her quest to unearth the reasons why I unearthed the social constructs that still today in many ways place women in a position of of subjugation to higher orders of society where man usually has the last word. it was important to read again in a new light Greek and Roman mythology, because according to her and according to her work, that's where they really inform the way we think about gender, the way we think about society, the way we think about power and class. So basically, one interesting poem that she wrote, one interesting book that she wrote, called Genes do Amor, or The Genesis of Love.
2005, right? Mm-hmm.
Exactly. What she did was she placed the muses of different writers, such as Camões, Dante, and Petrarca, talking to each other. These women, so these are the women who these poets wrote to. These are the women that these poets described as, perfect, the embodiment of perfection, the embodiment of femininity. But nevertheless, we never hear these women speak in their poems. Well, Camões dedicated many poems to Natércia, Dante to Beatriz, and Petrarca, the Italian poet, to Laura. But of course, we never hear their perspective of love, their perspective of life. So what Ana Luísa Amaral did was she gave a voice to these three fictional women, and well, fictional to a certain extent, because some scholars believe that some of these women actually existed, but obviously then in poetry they are these sort of fictional female characters. She puts them in dialogue, and that way we see their perspective of about love, but also about writing. A lot of her, I think we can say that her poetry is really a reflection, above all, a reflection about writing itself, and especially writing from the point of view of a woman. So these three women were basically not only speaking about love, questioning the role of men and women in love, and especially questioning the way love is portrayed and has been portrayed in literature, and how women didn't have a voice, or didn't usually have a voice in canonical literature. I don't know if Linda can
add something to that. In a way, her travel through time was to examine how, even in Greek and Roman mythology, where we have goddesses, and so for many people they would say, well, in these societies women were highly regarded because the pantheon had goddesses. In reality, to her and to some of other people, some of us, I think we both, Inez and I both share that really is almost the beginning of placing womanhood, or the feminine space, in that space that is somehow separated from the human, the mundane, the everyday power level. In a way, it's basically sending them to another level of discourse, in which they are always subjected to an overall God who is always male. So that was part of what was that spark to make it go. When did we start? When was this whole notion developed, and how we've inherited that throughout Western literature and tradition. Actually, I do want to read the poem at this time, and it's because of what you just said, because one of the poems I'd selected was No Nymphs or Muses. And so, because that was one of the things she struggled with, that male poets have a series of muses, most of whom are female. And even in the case of males who have a different sexual orientation, there is a fictional, if not female identified figure, at least ambiguous figure that is a muse. So, but who are the muses for female writers? So that was one of the things she concerned herself about when looking at the writing, of female writing, of female authorship, poetry in specific. So let me share her words, which are so much better than mine. So in any way, so here it goes. No nymphs or muses. No nymphs or muses, only a force that comes from within, a touch of madness, of the abyss that frightens and seduces. A fountain of thread-thin water, finer than fine. A too bright moonbeam would dry it up. No river or leer, no river, no leer, no female flood of nymphs, only some inherited force in a fountain where the moon does not shine. So I think this poem is clear on that, as far as we women, or female women who are writing poetry, in a way are their own muses. They have to be not only the author, but the inspiration. And in her poetry, we see that her muse was life, was women's life. The most mundane things, one of my favorite poems, and I couldn't find it because I really wanted to read it, was about when she talks about when she was in school and she was reciting verb tenses in French. And actually, it's one of those poems that I think doesn't translate really well because of the French, but it's one of my favorite poems from her. I love that poem, absolutely love it, because I remember that struggle. And she and I shared the trait.
Ines can read perfectly in
Perfect.
French, right?
Yes, I have that poem here. Let me just.
Oh,
I wasn't
great.
planning on reading that one. Let me just look for it. I can read it. It's a long poem, so I'm just going to read one part.
But you know, she and I shared something that I know you don't share, Ines, is that both she and I were, I don't know how to say this in English, Maria Rapaz, when we were young girls. We were always getting in trouble. We were climbing trees and doing all kinds of things, ripping our ruffles, because our parents insisted in dressing us in ruffles and ruffling the ruffles of the regime. She and I had that in common. We have been raised through the regime and had gone down the same path. So we shared a lot about that. So that poem touched me very deeply.
Okay, so I can read a little bit. There are parts in French that were not translated. So basically she's reminiscing about her French classes and the summer where she had to practice French. Old copybook where I wrote out my French themes, mes vacances. I adored holidays. Je suis allée à la plage with 2 E's. The verb être, asking to agree. J'ai beaucoup nagé. And then I'd end with the sunset over the sea, looking up goals in the dictionary. Corrections in red and the passé simple, writing nous fûmes, vous êtes, vous fûmes, ils furent 100 times during sunny afternoons. And Madame Denise, who said, toi ma petite, like a drill sergeant, her face turning angry and red. I have too many globules. Faites attention. And that look which contradicted all, with rempli tenderness. And the rules memorized and the verb endings during extra help and the falling afternoon light, pulling beneath the desks, our nun lost in her psalms, me dreaming over my open book. Once upon a time, there was a little boy and the algebraic equations with X as unknown. Beautiful afternoons when it was good to be good, and neither the little saint nor candy, but the sweet word fondling me from within, our white smock spotted with bright-hued gouache, the blue belt I always wore draped like a swashbuckler, and it goes on.
It's a wonderful poem.
Yes, it is.
So I don't know if we're answering your questions, Duarte, but you
Yes,
just,
you
know,
guys
we're talking
keep going
about,
on. I feel like there's no need a moderator.
irreverent poet and you're speaking to two irreverent women. So, you
yes,
know,
yes,
this is life.
it's good. It's good. Let's go back a little bit in what you said about love, and later I'll read also as well a poem of Ana Luísa Amaral. But let's talk about love and sexuality in her poetry. So I was
to me. To whom are you speaking?
No, I will start with possibly Dinesh, just to keep order. But either you.
No, I just want to know.
Yeah. So it's in my opinion, in the poetry of Ana Luísa Amaral, there's basically no reference to platonic love or oniric love or from the sphere of dreams. Our poetry, love is always depicted as very physical and sexual. First, do you agree with this statement? And I know it's hard to find what is the reason behind, but what do you think was the intention of Ana Luísa Amaral of this physical love and this predominant sexuality?
Right. Well, I do think there are a few poems where I think we can see the presence of more, spiritualized platonic love. But it is true that is, very, embodiment, and the body is very much prominent in her poetry. And I think that is also part of her desire to really showcase women's desire, which was also shunned from Portuguese, from poetry in general and Portuguese poetry in particular for many, many, many years. So I think she really, wanted to, of course, cut with that sort of with that tradition.
Sorry to interrupt. Yes. Do you think it also? Go ahead. Sorry to interrupt you real quick. Do you think it's also the reason? And here we can talk about the also the Ana Luísa Amaral as an essayist and translator. Do you think this is also the reason why she translated into Portuguese and her PhD thesis was about Emily Dickinson? Is the same reason?
Well, it's interesting that we speak about, physical love and passion and love, and connected with Emily Dickinson, who was a woman that we know was, in terms of her biography, a sort of a social recluse who just, didn't leave her house for decades. And, we don't know a lot about her, her love life, but probably it was not,
the most active.
Not the most active, probably non-existent in terms of physical love. Nevertheless, yes, there is passion in Emily Dickinson's poetry, to the point that, Ana Luísa Amaral speaks often about how she decided to work on Emily Dickinson's poetry. And it was precisely because after reading a poem that spoke about actually pain, but pain also due to, pain of love in a very, very, strong, passionate way, and physical way in a way. One thing that I think is interesting about Ana Luísa Amaral is that often her most erotic poems actually have many, many references to food. And this is another topic that is very interesting in Ana Luísa Amaral. Well, domesticity is another topic that is important for her because of its association with femininity and women. But it's also interesting how she connects food with love and with erotic desire. I would like to read a poem. Often, again, as I said, many of her poems can also be read as a meta poem, or in other words, as a way of reflecting about poetry itself. So often, her poems have many, we can read them on many levels. So the poem I'm going to read now, called The Most Perfect Image, I think combines all of these levels that I was just mentioning. Were I to sweep every morning these shrubs' spiky leaves off their harboring ground, I would then have a perfect metaphor for the reason why I've come to unlove you. Were I to wipe clean every morning this window pane and feel beyond my reflection the distracted transparency of nothingness, I would see the shrub is but a small inferno in the absence of the decasyllabic flame. Were I to look every morning at the cobweb woven between its branches, I would also understand the imperfection that eats at its thread, from May to August, disarming its geometry, its color. Were I even now to see this poem in the manner of a conclusion, I would not ice how its lines grow and rind in an uncertain and discontinuous prosody unlike mine, like slow wind eroding. I would also learn that longing belongs to a web woven in another time, a memory of some insistent beauty perched on some neuron of mine, the fire of a funeral pyre, the most perfect image of art and of farewell. Well, this one in particular does not actually have references to food in general, but to domesticity in general, actually. And again, this cleaning motif, this cleaning image as a way of, and natural elements as a way of reflecting about writing, I think are also very present in her poetry. So yeah, I actually, this poem doesn't really have many references to food in particular, but often those themes are associated.
Yeah. Dear Linda, thank you, Inês.
Well, let me see. It is for sometimes difficult to describe or to talk about Ana Luísa, because to her, life was poetry. What happened every day was poetry.
I have a question about that too.
So, and that is the simplicity. It's that simple action of the mundane, of the daily activity that brings the greatness that she has, the power in her poetry, because the poetry came to us through her, but her generosity goes to the point that she is giving it to us in a way of saying, your life is grand. Your everyday activity is poetry. Everything you do, cooking your meals, putting oranges on the fruit bowl, all of that is art. As far as the question of love, I disagree with you to a point. Love is in every single verse of every single poem that she ever wrote. To her, writing is an act of love. So I don't agree that the only kind of love we have is sexually related. I think that when we see,
I just say it was very. I don't.
Yeah.
I didn't say there was no other loves. I said that is very predominant. Is very
don't feel attacked.
Physical. Yeah. No. I'm not attacked at all. But like I'm just saying that.
So as far as there are a couple of reasons that we would see the erotic poetry. First of all, is she's going on in that great tradition of Portuguese poets who have been, and writers as a whole, who have been making assertions regarding the fact that women are erotic, that women have sexual desires and sexual passion, that women, there is this somewhat constructed myth that love to women is this, some constructed notion of medieval love, that it's all spiritual, and that women do not partake in non-spiritual love, that there is not a detachment of the physical and the spiritual in women when regarding sexual performance or sexual desire. And I think she tries to make that very clear, that women are sexual beings just like men are, that and that the desire process is present in both of them. So in a way, she's trying to debunk that notion of sexuality being attached in women, sexuality being necessarily attached to spirituality. she is trying to point out to you, when a woman has intercourse, when a woman has sex, when a woman is passionate with a man, this is not necessarily a spiritual act. It's a physical act. And she, much of the time, or even in the early 90s, when she began to publish, and we need to understand a lot of these poems were written prior to that. Mm-hmm. This was still an issue. This is still an issue today, right? So that was, I think, something that was important for her to make that distinction. Mm-hmm. Yes. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yes, I have. Go ahead, Ines.
Just to add, I think I agree. I think her poetry is more sensual than sexual. And that, I think that's also why a lot of her poems associate desire, sensuality with food as well. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I would say it's more sensual than sexual. I agree.
Yes. If you have ever gone to her house for dinner, and my God, she was an unbelievable cook. And she did it with great ease. You know, like we're in the middle of reading something and discussing whatever. And she's like, oh, I have to go to the oven. And she would just, it was so easy. And of course I would argue with her, no, we need to go out. And she's like, no. So if you'd ever eaten at her house, you knew when that food came on that table that it was an act of love. Mm-hmm. Nobody could produce the things she produced if she wasn't giving us, she wasn't loving us through sustaining us, through giving us food. Dinner at her house was indescribable. It's sort of like getting the best of both worlds. You're getting, chef quality food almost, although with none of the little, decoration things and all the fancy schmancy stuff, but the quality, the detail of it. And in the middle of it, there were conversations, and then, so it was an enriching event. They were enriching events. It's really hard to describe.
Let's leave.
Yes, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. Let's leave food.
Definitely, I can also have memories of that. Meals cooked by her, and she giving us recipes of her soups, and she really just loved to have friends around the table.
Poem, like we're in the middle of a poem, and she would say, well, how is the soup? Do you like it? And then she would say, well, this is how I make it, and then we go on with the same poem. So it's just, I think Lineage can share the feeling. It's impossible to describe because you can only see in your mind's eye what you can imagine and understand, and having that intimacy with her is not describable. It's not imaginable. I find myself at a loss for words, which is really not common.
So let's leave food for a little bit, and let's talk about and going back. I will start with Delinda now for the question, but I would like to read a poem. It's actually a meta poem. It's a poem about love, but also a poem about poetry,
which is love.
Which is love, yes. But it's called Etymologist, and it goes like this. I know your car by heart, the light shape of the seats, the anguish of each of its windows, the color of all its trimmings. I know your hand by heart, cutting through the inside of the car, I know by heart. Each stroke reenacted in a digital imprint, the shape of each of your fingers on the inside of your hand, the syntax learned by rote of the car, I know by heart, etymologically from the depths of one's heart. So the question, and we already talked about sensual love, of course, but the question that I have about this poem is that in the poetry, and first for Dylan and then for Ines, in the poetry of Ana Luísa Amaral, the readers finds common references to random objects or places as well. I was even commenting with Ines before there has been something used, for instance, in the art, like art povera, but I think Ana Luísa Amaral was a real pioneer in incorporating these random objects and places in poetry, on modern Portuguese poetry. Do you think, Linda, that this is related somehow to the metaphysical thought of the author, in this case, Ana Luísa Amaral, or is also a way of the author to give voice to voiceless or unanimated things?
That poem is about intimacy.
Mm-hmm.
Intimacy at a level that it's beyond love.
Mm-hmm.
And what better way than to use everyday mundane things to, and it goes a little bit back to what I said before. But what was really important to her was for her readers, and especially her female readers, to understand that what they already have, what they already live, is love, is art. And she brings mundane things in so that we can all identify with them. Because to her, love was not this grand thing that, is going to move a mountain. You don't love somebody because you move a mountain. You love somebody because you know the touch of their hand, because it's in the small little things in life, to her, where beauty, where art, where love resides. Mm-hmm. And so to me, that's the insistence of the mundane. The insistence of the mundane is also to give us the message, us readers, this is in my life, it's in your life, it's in, that's why you don't need nymphs or muses, because you have your life. You have everything there. So again, I'll go back. Do I have time to read a second poem?
Yes, we do.
But because it does talk about this, and it's a little long, but I'll try to be as fast as I could. And it's about the mundane, and the title of the program is Mini Ode in the Form of a Semi-Biographical Note. Good morning, dog and cat, and thank you for your early morning greeting, velvet body, soft tongue, which means in simultaneous translation, good morning. Good morning, sun, and thank you for coming in and offering me this mirror in which I see myself full face. Your bright sun lies this sheet of paper and inscribing on it with one transparent ray time. Good morning to all things glossy, to all things glossy out on the balcony. The leaves of the camellia, whose very name shines the song of that bird. And if the world suddenly has become more world, and in such a way that we may never again see the day darken. Good morning to all those tiny creatures invisible to me from my chair, but who are all there, ants and spiders, minuscule insects, all doomed to die, but who will still be born here every day. Good morning, daughter. So like a sunflower, how many more times will I say good morning, glancing over at the corridor? You no longer on the lulled to sleep, but pure love, pure filigree, and my sun almost setting. Good morning, sofa, where I sit at night, slowly, the flowers sometimes absent and sometimes peeling this table, the glass door illuminated, all right angles, books and paintings, small photographs in brief disorder. Good morning to you too, and thank you for the thread of perfume you brought me, waxing a rough wooden floor of the veins of a plant eager for leaves, or even the flawed peace you gave me, the same peace I wish for you. Despite the discordant note of waking each morning to a world full of so many sunless hands, despite the disorder, violent rushing current that is the world, despite all, there is this brief note of opening my eyes and saying good morning and breathing in the newly fresh air filling everything. So I think that is the answer to your question. Yeah.
Inês, you would like to add something about the...
Yes, I think one other aspect of her poetry was also how she tried to do a sort of a genealogy of women in literature. So basically, she basically also wanted to speak about the difficulty that women have had across centuries to write and to be writers. So some of her poems speak about how she has to try to make time to write in the middle of the daily chores of running a household and raising a child. And many poems speak about that. So I think this is also again a way of speaking about writing, the process of writing, the history of literature, and especially from the point of view of women and the role that they have had in literature, and still today how it's still even more difficult for women to write because they really are charged with so many other tasks that are usually associated with femininity, and how they have a sort of a special effort they have to make they have to create their own room in the space of literature.
Well, I think it goes beyond just the writing, because it's not just difficult for the writing process within all its, all the chaos. And I think she talks of the disorder that women's life ends up being, where she is catering to a whole lot of things and fulfilling a professional obligation and this and that and raising children. Just as Inês said, once you write, and if you can pass that hurdle and you actually write, because it wasn't difficult for Ana Luísa to write. The poet, you just poured out of her. I used to joke with her and tell her she was the female version of Ari dos Santos. I always joked about that, and she would laugh. Because poetry did just come out, pour out of her. You'd notice it when you were speaking to her, that if we could just record what she said, we could publish books of poetry. But then it becomes the problem of the entire system. How do women publish? Poetry is hardly, there's very little publication of poetry. It's very difficult for poets to publish in Portugal, which is her market. And then beyond that, it's even more difficult for women to publish, women poets to publish. And and then comes the whole other cycle, which is the awards cycle. It is extremely difficult for women who are not connected, let me put it this way, to receive awards as in poetry, in general, in literature, but in poetry specifically, because this is what we're talking about. And Ana Luísa received many awards in spite of that, and that simply because the brilliance of her poetry was uncontrollable. That, to me, that is sort of the most interesting thing about her poetry. You know how when you pick up a novel and you read the first 3 pages and you can't stop reading? It's basically the same thing with her poetry books. You read the first 3 poems and you feel these sort of emotional explosions inside you, and you just need more. I've never read poetry with the same intensity that I read Ana Luísa. I usually don't read a poetry book from the beginning to the end, or sometimes from the end to the beginning, which I have a habit of doing with poetry. But with her, I do. I can't put the book down. And I always read her poetry out loud. which makes me read it 4, 5, 6, 7 times. So I feel I'm stopping where she wants me to stop. So I think that was the greatest importance to her, that to bear witness that women write, that the female space, the feminine space is a space of art production, is a space of creativity, and that and she did that with mastery. She is in about 50 years, Ines, and maybe you will be discussing with young scholars the brilliance of Ana Luísa's poetry, and how it was cutting edge poetry for her generation. Many times we have the generation, especially the generation of Três Marias, which we already talked about and whom she admired tremendously, whose work she felt was essential, and it was at that time. But if you look at that poetry, there is, in a way, there is an underlying anger of being denied. And in Ana Luísa's poetry, that anger is not there, because there is sort of an affirmation of, you cannot deny me, because art is within me, and you can't deny what is mine. And the simple life that you want me to be subjected to, domesticity that you feel is that you, society, are imposing upon me as my space, that is a space of art and of creativity. So you can't reduce me, which is really cutting edge. She is really the next generation of women writers in Portugal that took that anger and built on it from a space of beauty, and in a way of serenity. If you read her poetry, you come out serene. It's not, and yet it is extremely to the point. You can see inequality. You can feel it's there. It's clear and powerful. Yet you remain serene.
Let me just pick in what you said, and we're approaching to the end of our event.
I am so sorry.
So if the audience wants to put some questions on the chat, please feel free. But I would like to make a last question to both of you. So we already talked about. We know that Ana Luísa Amaral was an advocate of women's rights, and she played a big role in defending the women's space, socially speaking. But what other social and political concerns did Ana Luísa Amaral had, and how did she address in her poetry? Ines, I know you even have a poem, but go ahead.
Yes, I think this is a good poem also to finish our conversation. She was very much aware of the politics of her time, and very engaged as well politically. I would say that's one of. She has a few poems dedicated to the issue of immigration, and in particular to the immigration coming from the Middle East to Europe and North Africa to Europe. That is very clear in her poetry as well. So she's very much a woman of her time, and very engaged politically. I think to show this, I would like to read, and also this also ties in with what Yolinda said, because even though the poem that I'm going to read, of course, reminds us of the tragedy that have been taking place in the Mediterranean nowadays, but also there is an element of humor in a way, not necessarily humor, I would say, but there is an element of some sort of relief in the end. So I'm just going to read this poem, Prayer in the Mediterranean. Instead of fishes, Lord, give us peace, a sea of innocent waves, and once we reach the shore, people who see with their hearts, voices that accept us. The voyage is so hard, even the foaming waters won't unboil, and during the crossing, rise high enough to blind. Lord, let there be no deaths this time. May the rocks keep their distance, may the wind drop, and may your peace finally spread and multiply. But after the raft, after the war, the tiredness, after the generous open arms, Lord, some fresh bread would be good, and a little fish, if possible, from the sea. That is also our sea.
Thank you, Inês. Yolinda, you want to add something really brief to end?
Well, as you can imagine, many of the discussions I had with Ana Luísa were political.
I had doubts.
And mostly about how female issues, things that pertain to the depenalization of abortion, birth rights, or the right to control your own body and to own your own space, in legislation during divorce proceedings, a lot about domestic violence. We spend a lot of time talking about that, and the inefficiency of the court system in Portugal to interpret the law as we both believe was meant to be written. So she was very political, and many of the poems she wrote, although you may not think are political poems, they really are. Because it's this affirmation of equality. Yeah. She uses...
Sorry to interrupt you, Dylan. I can state that because the first time I met Ana Luísa Amaral was on this event they organized for the Cátedra, and she read a poem completely against of Anna Atterley, I think Anna, completely against the dictatorship, where Anna Atterley basically assumes let's face this dictatorship. So I can testify that it was. Anyway,
so to say that her political engagement was not well known, that does not mean it was not present. To my knowledge, she never ran for office, but she was a keen observer and actively supported candidates she felt could bring forth the cause of a true equality, which is very different than a legal standard of equality. But that would be a whole other discussion that we don't want to get into. But we in Portugal, I think, with the loss of Ana Luísa, lost one of the true voices of femininity.
And poetry too.
Yeah, and poetry. But
I had a question about Ana Luísa, but I'm not going to ask this because it was a provocation. Because I feel like Ana Luísa is much more read in Spanish than in Portuguese, and in English than in Portuguese, unfortunately. But I had a question for that. If you like...
There is a good reason for that.
Okay.
Many times people don't know why, but her poetry in Portuguese causes them some underlying discomfort. Many times they're not really aware of, and I've had several discussions about this, where people feel, I like this, but I think it's saying this, and I don't agree with that. How can I like this? I'm not sure I'm making any sense. But I think that could be. And again, the poetry reading public in Portugal is minuscule, and even so for a female writer.
Mhm.
So if you look at the numbers, there were probably there's 10 million people in Portugal, and there are probably less than 50,000 people who regularly read poetry.
Yeah, I agree.
So we're talking about a public that is minuscule,
Mhm.
and a lot of people are very afraid of intimacy, and her poetry forces us to be intimate with ourselves.
I think and just to end, I think it's Ana Luísa Amaral poetry is fearless, right? She has no fear, completely
and
open.
no filters,
It's
and no filters.
yeah, and it speaks about the freedom that she always claimed, and I would like to thank, I know she's not here, but I would like to thank, and on behalf of the Center for Portuguese Studies, because she never said, and I go back to the beginning where we were saying, she never said no to me.
Yes, no,
and
she never said no to many people.
To many people. She was a super generous person.
To whom she said no.
Yeah, she was a fantastic author, writer. She was a fantastic translator as well. She, with maybe Maria Irene Ramalho, actually brought this study of North American literature, which was something new back in Portugal in the 80s, 70s, and 90s. It's completely new for us. And so I would like to thank that. And I would like to thank also all your presence and contribution, Inês and Yolinda, for this event. All our guests, we run out of time. But I just would like to remind, in this case, Ana Luísa Amaral, and the next events of the Center for Portuguese Studies, which will be completely different next week. We are co-sponsoring an event about municipal government in the EU with Professor António Ramalho from University of Minho. And then on the 31st of this month, in person, we're going to have here an event celebrating José Saramago, another fantastic writer. The event is called José Saramago Life with No Interruptions. It's going to be on October 31st here at the Center for Portuguese Studies. And also in November 7, we're going to have our annual conference on Ana Atali. We're going to talk about translation. And this is going to be also on in-person event, hybrid, let's say. Having said that, thank you so much to all of you. And I hope to see you soon in one of our next events. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you